Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Matt Bernico. I teach at Greenville University. I teach things like media archaeology, cultural studies, podcasting classes. That's a real thing I'm doing this semester. And I don't know. And I do this podcast, and that's fun.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, Ontario, and I write as a journalist and do a bunch of other stuff. I just came back from a conference in Atlanta from the Political Theology Network, and that was really a cool thing to do.
Yeah, how'd the conference go? Was it fun?
It was fun. I presented a paper that Matt and I both wrote together on Christians for Socialism, past and present, so kind of a history thing, and chatting a little bit about what's going on now and how it fits into conversations about the Christian and religious left. And yeah, it was really neat. Actually, I should just help them out a little bit by plugging. They have a podcast now called Assembly, and it seems like it's going to be cool. They are going to post some of the conversations that were going on at the conference, and the network seemed really, really neat. If you do research, like if you're a student or an activist, and you do research on political theology or do work in it, it might be something worth kind of checking out. So I don't know, keep your eye on that thing. They have a Twitter presence and a Facebook, and they have an academic journal, but they're kind of trying to expand it into more, I guess, more nodes, trying to get more people on board. So it's a cool thing. I guess, I mean, I'm going to go next year, so that's a good review.
Well, yeah. I heard about the podcast the other day from Vincent Lloyd. He was at the conference you were at, and then he came all the way to Greenville to give a guest lecture and chapel address about mass incarceration. So it's like we were together, but through a third person who, wasn't either of us, but okay, great.
yeah.
Sort of like mediation, but I don't know, something going on there.
There's a Hegel joke, but we just cannot find it.
Yeah. Well, it was cool hanging out with Vincent Lloyd. That was pretty dope. He was
same.
Here for a few days. Yeah. I ate dinner with him. I ate pizza with him twice. How about that? I ate 2 times.
That's more than I did.
Yeah. And it was cool. So hung out with him.
I did get beer with Amoria, though. Amoria Armstrong, who does the music for our podcast, and I feel like that's a pretty good thing to check off my bucket list. I've done it. It's on the list now, and now it's off the list. So got that going for me.
That's extremely cool. Did you see your paper?
I did not, because we presented at the same time. Tragically, frustratingly. I know. It's just how it goes at conferences,
Yeah, that is exactly how it goes. Conference presenters, conference organizers, get on that. Stop scheduling all the good papers at once.
That's right. Well, Vincent Lloyd is a very good transition. I don't know if we're ready to make it.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, good. Vincent Lloyd's a good transition because way back in the Magnificast vault is episode 6 of this show, where we talked to Vincent about a ton of stuff about prison abolition and some of the research he was doing on it, but also about Huey P. Newton and some of the sort of theological currents that informed Newton and the Black Panther Party. Believe it or not, there were a lot of them, I guess. That's what Vincent has researched and uncovered, and he does a pretty good job of it. And so in this episode, we decided to do a little bit of that work ourselves and kind of read a little bit of Huey P. Newton stuff and pull some of those themes out. Everybody's talking about Black Panther because it's a movie. And so we decided we're gonna talk about the real Black Panthers, but specifically Huey P. Newton, some of the stuff he had to say about the church and Jesus in particular.
Yeah, before we go any further, though, I need to share this story that someone posted on the Magnificast basement. So if you are not sure what that is, the Magnificast basement is our Facebook group, and you can join it. Just search the Magnificast basement. That's a deep cut joke from episode 2. Maybe a billion episodes ago. Anyways, someone posted this story there. I guess a friend of mine was glancing over my shoulder and saw I was reading about the Black Panthers breakfast programs. Then the friend says, man, that movie is doing some intense marketing.
They sure are.
I like so much that someone out there thinks that that there's a guerrilla marketing team for the film Black Panther that is also doing the work of the Black Panther Party.
It truly would be guerrilla marketing.
Oh my gosh. It was. That's such a good thing. It's such a good thing and such a funny thing not to know, but I like it so much.
I don't know. You just like, how would you even begin that conversation and explain it?
Yeah, it would be a difficult one to have, I think. You'd need to take several steps back from that basic assumption right there. But I mean, I guess it makes sense though, right? Like people are buying out theaters and letting like people go see it for free, and like that's been an awesome thing. The movie's been like really important for people of color, and that's awesome. And then like I don't know, just also making people breakfast. I don't know.
Why not? They
Marvel
should
get on it. Yeah, I think they should.
Yeah, I saw the movie. Did you see the movie?
Oh yeah, I saw the movie hard.
Nice. Yeah, it was a good movie. I don't know. Not a thing I want to talk about on the podcast, but
no.
It was fun to watch anyway.
Yeah, it was really fun to watch. I don't want to talk about it on the podcast either because I feel like all of the good takes have been taken already. What I have enjoyed most about it is that everyone has so many ideas about it on Twitter, and
yeah,
it's like when a big movie comes out, people all of a sudden care about like media criticism, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
makes me feel good. I like reading all those good takes.
Yeah, it's generated a lot of cool discussion, even for, I mean, you know, like, it's good to be critical of Marvel movies and movies in general, and I appreciate that some of even the critical takes of the film are, like, very nuanced and interesting to read, as opposed to reading critiques of, I don't know, Marvel Civil War or something like that,
yeah.
Or, like, reading critiques of Iron Man, where you're like, yeah, that guy's a billionaire. Well, the end, moving on.
Yeah, I think so. Man, Kimberly Crenshaw wrote this great thing on Facebook about Black Panther and like the way she felt conflicted about like the role of the CIA in the film, and it was cool. Kimberly Crenshaw totally. is dope.
Yeah, Amoria had a bunch of cool stuff to say as well on Twitter and elsewhere.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, we're not going to talk about it, though. It's really important that we stick with that.
We're not.
You said
We're definitely not talking about it on this podcast.
But what we are going to do is talk about the extremely, just the way cooler Black Panther thing, the Black Panther Party and Huey P. Newton. Oof, that's one of those good transitions we've got going right there.
That's right.
So Dean, do you want to like flesh out a little bit about who Huey P. Newton is and like why we care about this guy?
Sure, a little bit. Before we jump in, though, just like a couple of disclaimer notes that probably seem obvious, but are worth mentioning, I guess. One is that, I mean, we're two white people talking about the Black Panther Party, and by virtue of that, we're extremely limited, and some things we say are probably wrong. So I guess, I don't know, take all of the following with a grain of salt and do your own research and figure that out and chat with people who know a lot more than we do about that. We're just really into these essays by Huey P. Newton, so figuring that out. And secondly, Huey P. Newton has a lot of gendered language in his own kind of writing, but we just kind of read the quotes as he had them, so it's not really an endorsement, or hopefully not an endorsement, of doing that, taking the male gender as a kind of universalizing discourse. But anyway, that's what he's doing, so we're just representing it in the way that he read it. Apart from that, we'll just jump into it. I won't go into too much detail, but I will preface this by saying Brett at Revolutionary Left Radio has been doing some pretty great episodes on the Black Panther Party historically and interviewing people who know a lot about it. And I would just encourage everyone to go listen to that, I guess, to start off. Just because there are a lot of people who know a lot more about it than we do. And he does all that really good work of bringing all those people together. So check that out. But the short of it is that the Black Panther Party was started a long time ago in the 60s. And it was started by a lot of folks. But one of them was a guy named Huey P. Newton. And he was a law student. And he was the Minister of Defense for the party, which is kind of maybe a funny thing to think about if you think about American Marxist-Leninist kinds of parties like the Black Panther Party. Newton was a fascinating character. He had a pretty wild life and a lot of ups and downs, you could say, I guess. But one very kind of cool and funny thing that he thought about was the Second Amendment. So he thought, well, the Constitution guarantees people gun rights. There's no reason that black people can't have guns and arm themselves in communities where they feel targeted. And that's exactly what the Black Panther Party did. So that was a kind of very interesting strategy that he helped to spearhead and really think about. And he became a really important theoretical voice of the party. And, you know, he was imprisoned and he became a sort of mythical figure in the party as a result of that. If you want to know more about that, I would encourage everyone, again, just to go back and listen to the episode we did do with Vincent Lloyd, episode 6, where he does a lot of good work kind of explaining, I guess, the aura around Huey P. Newton and some of the politics involved behind that. But the short of it is that he was an extremely important part of a real-life political party that happened in the U.S. that was premised on black liberation here at home and inspired by liberation movements around the world, like the movement in China and in Cuba and elsewhere. So really, really important character. And yeah, we decided on the podcast to check out a couple of his writings. So Matt, do you want to tell us what's going on with those two pieces?
Yeah, so we read two different things, and they're pretty eclectic. I mean, we wanted to find those places where Huey P. Newton was like talking about religion, because after all, this is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. So we found those things. So one essay we found is called "On the Relevance of the Church." It is like a essay, but kind of written like a letter or something, from 1971. And he talks about the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the church in communities. And then the second thing is a little bit different. It's called "The Son of Man," and it is from that big good growing library of radical religion journals that we've been collecting and amassing over time. And it's just kind of like a meditation, maybe almost a sermon on like Jesus as the leader of a popular revolutionary movement, or something like that. We'll get into it a little bit more here in a minute, but those are the two things we read. We'll definitely give you guys some links so you can follow along if you're playing the home game of the Magnificast. Don't play it, but read them. Don't play the home game, but read the articles. It's good.
We should add too that the radical religion excerpt comes from Newton's book Revolutionary Suicide, which is really long, but has a lot of other Christological themes within it. And this is just sort of one, I guess, abstracted component of that.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's start with the church stuff, and then we'll focus in on the Jesus stuff.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good division for this episode.
Yeah, that's the way we do it here. Church stuff first.
Part 1,
Jesus.
Church stuff. Part 2, Jesus stuff.
Yeah. Well, the church stuff is interesting. So in this article, basically, Huey P. Newton is just writing about the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the churches in their communities. And it's interesting because he kind of offers a corrective to the role the Black Panther Party has played in previous sort of criticisms of church and religion. And it's cool. It's a really great piece in terms of like the sort of similarities between organizing a party and organizing a church. We'll talk about those things in a minute, but it's also recognizing that like people are invested in religion, and like you can't just ignore that. You can't just like, write that off. So the church essay is cool for those reasons. I think it's a helpful way to start thinking through why churches are important to people who are involved in leftist struggles. I don't know. What did you take away from it, Dean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I tracked some similar themes there. It's interesting that the party is trying to think through how to connect with the community in general. And one thing that Newton keeps coming back to over and over is that the church is also trying to connect with the community. And maybe in part for different reasons and maybe through different strategies, but nevertheless, they're both kind of these groups that are trying to mobilize a certain, wider populace. And I guess one thing that I find so fascinating about the article is that you just see a revolutionary leader trying to think through how to partner with an organization that has experience trying to reach out to those communities and has a hold there and has a tradition there, and is, really working that out. It's also probably worth noting in this context that the Black Panther Party, part of those breakfast programs we were talking about a little bit earlier, they organized them in a church, primarily, that was sponsored by a Catholic priest, Monsignor Eugene Boyle, in California. So there's a real material alliance between the church and the party as well. It's not it's not as though Newton is just sort of thinking theoretically in abstraction about this. And of course, there's a long history of Black churches in particular having a space in the political scene in the United States, but specifically the party itself is organized largely within a Catholic church, at least in West California, so in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's maybe an interesting side note anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the article starts off just kind of describing the roles of institutions and how they work, and that the Black Panther Party is an institution and churches are institutions, and that what is important is that these institutions are somehow relevant to the communities that they are in, which seems like an obvious point, but it's kind of helpful to state it abstractly like that. So Huey Newton says that that's why churches develop new programs so that they become more relevant to the communities that they're in and people come to them. And the party is the same way, that it has to find ways to start programs that are relevant to the community, so that people will actually go and participate. I know this is a really simple and obvious point about organizing, but unless you have something to offer a community, I guess nobody really cares what you're doing. There's nothing transcendently good about the organization of church or party that will just make people go in and of itself. Churches, I guess, sometimes have that metaphysics and guilt to motivate people to go, even if it is really crappy. But I guess the way you attract new folks to your things is doing stuff that is interesting and important to them. It seems like an easy point, but I don't know, it's cool. It's worth making.
Yeah, I think so. It's also cool that they sort of view that as a way of being faithful to the communities that they serve, is sort of not being alienated from their daily life. That goes back a little bit to the stuff we were talking about with respect to Cornel West in the monthly review, where he was saying one thing leftists need to do is really overcome this allergy to religion, because if you want to be with the people, you have to be willing to understand that the people actually have things that they like to do and practices that they like to be part of and communities that they appreciate that don't necessarily have to be opposed to revolutionary praxis.
Yeah, for sure. I know that this is a quote that we trot out every single week, I think, but it all to me it always goes back to the thing about Fidel, that you just can't let religion just be a thing, a tool of the bourgeoisie to maintain oppression and control in society. So go to church and and show people what's up. On that note, there's a quote from the article where Huey Newton says just that. He says, so we go to church, we are involved in church, and not in any hypocritical way. Religion perhaps is a thing that man needs at this time because scientists cannot answer all the questions. He kind of goes into this sort of God of the gaps thing, which is not very compelling to me, but it's fine. The important thing isn't sort of the theology, but the important thing is that he and people in the Black Panther Party are getting involved in good faith. It seems he says not in any hypocritical way. They're going because their community goes. So that seems important.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit. Maybe the theology behind this, because it is very idiosyncratic, and I mean, it's fine to say that it's a bit particular to the party and to a materialist understanding of church. But one thing that's fascinating is he does go out of his way to say it's not hypocritical. They're not going to church just to, I guess, mobilize that community or cynically appropriate it toward revolutionary ends. They're trying to find a way to participate in their own kind of way. And what I think is so fascinating about that is the two sort of themes that keep popping up in this essay. One is, like you were saying, it's a sort of God of the gaps thing, right? So scientists can't explain everything, so in the meantime, God fills that role. So you go to church to kind of remind yourself that science isn't explaining every single thing in the universe, and we're sort of free to marvel at the things that we don't know. But the other thing that he deals with, which I find almost more fascinating, is this kind of mystical undercurrent where for him, the more we know, the more we'll be able to kind of become one. He used that kind of oneness language, one with the universe, or to commune with the universe in this important kind of way. And that's a theme that you can trace that all the way back to pick your favorite weird Christian mystic in the Christian tradition. This sense that knowledge kind of leads you on this ascent up to the heights of the divine or whatever, at which point the human and the divine become sort of indistinguishable. And I think that's what's so wild about this essay is with Newton you get this materialist reading of church, but you also get the sincerely mystic vision of theology. And I think that's something that really kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah, I agree that the mystical vision part is extremely cool. And to see him like that the idea is acting in good faith and not being like an entryist or something is worth noting. There's a part a little bit later in the essay that's interesting as well, where he goes on to say, I think it was rather arrogant of my party to criticize the community for trying to discover answers to spiritual questions. So like there's like this interesting sort of corrective where he has to step back and think like, well, maybe like the way we were positioning ourselves to the church was not so great. But then he goes on to say something I do actually really appreciate. The only thing we will criticize in the future is when the church does not act upon the evils that cause man to get on his knees and humble himself in awe at the large force which he cannot control. But as man becomes stronger and stronger and his understanding greater and greater, he will have a closer walk with thee. Note the song says walk, not crawl. So it's like the sort of position that Huey P. Newton puts the Black Panther Party in relationship to the church is this like one where they're not going to try to answer the spiritual questions in people's lives, and like they're not going to try to critique religion on that point. But what they will do is critique sort of the material reality that the church has to interact with, and that is good. That's why leftists should go to church, not to criticize religion and like make fun of people for believing in God or whatever, but to like point out the contradictions in the things we say and the what that actually means in practice.
Yeah, we've talked about that also in the past on the show, that one thing that leftists can really contribute to Christian communities is exactly that consciousness that is sort of born out of those struggles and participating in party movements and other leftist movements that, work really hard at trying to get to know what material pressure points are at work in a community. And that Christians sometimes in their own way intuit vaguely, or, maybe want to intuit, but kind of don't really know how, or they're wrapped up in a certain kind of language that prohibits them even from coming to a final conclusion about those kinds of issues, like about why poverty happens or about why some people are homeless. Leftists can really help, I think, Christian communities sort of authentically embody those hopes to help the poor, or to help the homeless, or to help, whatever marginalized community they're interested in. And there's something kind of neat about that too, that Newton really suggests that it doesn't have to be that these communities even have to merge in the exact same kind of way or whatever. They just need to find a way to relate on their own terms. And for the party, the Black Panther Party, that means calling out the church when it's taking these reactionary stands, which I feel like any authentic Christian should be sort of grateful for, being able to have that kind of voice that's able to kind of catch you when you can't really see outside your own Christian vocabulary or patterns of thinking or whatever.
Yeah, totally. So good. I'm glad we could reemphasize that whole point. Please go to church and tell us how wrong we are about so many things. I think that's the best idea. That's my missionary plea to leftists. Like, okay, I know theology is weird, and maybe you have a trouble with the metaphysics, and fine, great. I think I have trouble with those things too. but just come to church and tell us how wrong we are about the things we're doing. Oh my God, someone please.
Somebody's gotta.
Someone has to come to church and tell us how bad this is. Well, on that point, there is some more like illuminating stuff in here about the way that he sees the Black Panther Party as an institution and the church as an institution. So he tells like a little narrative about his childhood. His father was a minister, and that he spent 15 years in church. So he has, I think, a lot of this. I think that Christianity is sort of just like a thing that's in his brain because of his childhood, which I can relate to. I'm sure his church is different than mine, though. In a lot of ways. different Christianities, I would imagine. Anyways, there's this part where he kind of goes on to say, though, that he says, as man develops and understands more, he will approach God and finally reach heaven and merge with the universe. Again, there's like that sort of like mystic quality in the rhetoric he uses and the sort of theology that's there. And then he says, I've never heard one preacher say that there is a need for the church in heaven. The church would negate itself. As a man approaches his development and becomes larger and larger, the church therefore becomes smaller and smaller because it's no longer is not needed any longer. Then, if we had ministers who would deal with the social realities that cause misery, so that we can change them, man will become larger and larger. At that time, the God within will come out, and we can merge with him. Then we will be one with the universe. So, there's some really wild stuff going on there too about sort of like the purpose of institutions is to carry out sort of a goal and then to negate itself. Right. That's a pretty fun idea. I don't really know. That's such a hard thing to think about in terms of the church, because like eschatology for Christians is like such a large and long scope thing. But like, I don't think there's anything wrong with what he's saying in the sense that like the church would negate itself sort of eschatologically. There'll have to be a time when like the church's goal is over and done because like mission complete, end of the world kind of stuff happens or whatever. But yeah. But like in a more practical way, the church has like really material goals, and it can complete those goals and negate itself in some interesting ways.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's the song that we end on every single episode every week, right? From the Illogical Spoon. I don't want to get up for church in the morning, and heaven come to earth, and there won't be no church. We'll meet down at the riverside, right? That's kind of the whole idea, is that there's this eschatological vision where you don't actually have to get up too early and like drag yourself out of bed to go to church, because you'll be living in the future that you're sort of modeling on Sunday mornings, hopefully.
Yeah, that's neat. That's why I picked that song so many episodes ago.
Just all anticipating this moment we could articulate it.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk a little bit, Matt, about the way that this exploration of church, however you want to look at it, relates to the exploration of church in other communities that we've looked at on past episodes. Specifically, I've been thinking a little bit about the Gospel in Solentinae and kind of how they were reading biblical stories and narratives and thinking about their own organization of church. Was there anything in this essay that kind of stuck out to you that maybe has some echoes there or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, well, I'll get the easy one out of the way really quick. The way that like Fidel talked about religion in the Fidel and Religion book with Fray Beto is like really similar to the way that Huey P. Newton talks about religion as well. So there's like tons of really obvious similarities there, and I think even more that we're going to find in the next part about Jesus. But there's a really interesting sort of like ethical call and evaluation in this bit about church from Newton. Okay, so it's actually not about church as such, but it's more about one of the projects of the Black Panther Party, and but there's a really similar way that they understand the world ethically and in terms of justice that I think is similar in terms of the Gospel in Solentinae. Okay, so he tells this really interesting story. I guess long story short, one of the things that the Black Panther Party was doing at this point was trying to like make like a factory that would make clothes for people and just kind of hand them out. and specifically shoes. Shoes was like a big thing that they were worried about. So he kind of tells a story about why shoes are important to the Black Panther Party. So he says that we'll point out that everyone in the society should have shoes, and we should not have a situation like the one in Beaufort County, South Carolina, where 70% of the children suffer brain damage because of malnutrition. They have malnutrition because of the combination of not enough food and parasites in the stomach. The worms eat up half the food that the child take in. Why? Because the ground is infested with eggs, the eggs of the worms, and the children don't have shoes to wear. So as soon as we send a doctor there to cure the illness, they get the parasites again. We think that the shoe program is a very relevant thing, first to help them stay alive, then to create conditions in which they can grow up and work out a plan to change things. If they have brain damage, they will never be revolutionists because they will already have been killed. That is genocide itself. So in that story, in like that evaluation of a situation, like, first of all, like, how brilliant is it? Just like, oh well, we'll just make shoes for people. That's like a pretty cool thing to do. But anyways, in that ethical judgment of the situation, we see something really similar in the Gospel in Soul and Taname, and the way they think about the like genocide and like the infanticide and sort of the connections that has with the nativity story and Herod. It's again like that focus on children and the understanding of like the sort of the revolutionary nature of children, and like sort of like the potentiality bound up in their lives and like what they could become, and like the ways that they'll interact with the world that you can help them see. So all of that's kind of there in that story, and it's such an easy connection. I mean, it's the exact same thing that I don't remember what the person's name was in Soul and Taname. Shoot. Well, I should have looked it up. But anyways, one of those folks in that, I mean, they made the exact same point that like when children starve, like they will like, you know, that is infanticide. That could be genocide. That's like you're neglecting a class of people who will be disproportionately affected by poverty, and that moral judgment of calling it genocide is worthwhile and something that I think has some religious connotations to it.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, that's that situation has not gone away. Not just the shoe problem, but I mean, Matt and I have done some research on Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis there, and it's the same kind of thing, right? Like, so many children were exposed to lead poisoning, and even if they do end up solving the problem in the near future, which they still haven't. I mean, it's been a few years now, crazily, since the crisis has been brought to public attention. Even if they do solve that problem, there are children there who they've already been affected by lead poisoning, such that, I mean, the damage is not reversible. That community will be affected forever. And I mean, lead poisoning is already sort of linked to difficulty in learning and greater incarceration rates. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same exact pattern kind of replaying itself in a horrifying kind of way. So the kind of thing that the peasants in Solentiname identified as Christians, you know, that the destruction of children is a sort of repetition of the destruction of all the children by Herod. And also the observation from Newton here that the destruction of children is a genocidal act that's still going on right now in a place like Michigan. So, and all over the United States and other parts of the world, right? You know, First Nations communities and elsewhere. So, yeah, I don't know. It seems like these kinds of themes are just more and more relevant for Christians and leftists alike in a way that should be kind of a natural affinity.
Yeah, that's right. I think that just I know that the term genocide is strong language to use about those situations, but even though that is strong language and like strong rhetoric, I think it's worth it. It's so hard to elicit an actual reaction from Christians on these issues of like justice, especially like when it comes to the ways that poverty are wrapped up in them, and race are wrapped up in them. In the case of Flint, like, I don't know if evangelicals are so absolutely, you know, staunch about their views about like being pro-life or whatever, then like step up. Like, this is one of those times when they should actually care.
Yeah, and it drives home that materialist critique of theology, right? Because evangelicals don't care in a material way.
That's right. So come to our churches and tell us to care.
Exactly. For real, though.
Make us do it. Oh my God. Someone will have to make us, because apparently so many Christians are incapable of thinking through that in a really critical way.
Yeah. Well, that's a good good transition to Jesus, the one who's supposed to make us do a lot of things.
Yeah.
So Huey P. Newton had a lot of thoughts about Jesus. As Vincent talked about a long time ago, there's actually a lot of really interesting Christological resonances between Huey P. Newton's position in the Panthers and also just, whatever, Jesus' meaning to Christian communities. And it's cool that Newton kind of took the time to really think through what Jesus' ministry was like. And in this piece that we were looking at, he employs a very interesting materialist understanding of Jesus and the Gospels in general. And there's so much to say about it. We will say a bunch of things about it, I guess. That's what this podcast is for. But one thing that I think is cool to note up front is that I was genuinely surprised by how conversant Newton was with certain themes in biblical studies and theology, specifically German Protestant theology. I don't know what that connection is or why he was aware of them, but he's name dropping people like Schweitzer and Barth and others, and there's something kind of very fascinating about that. I mean, he's an academic, so that part's not surprising. Like, I'm not surprised that he reads books, but I guess it's surprising to me that one of the leaders of a revolutionary party would take the time to get to know that literature as well as he apparently did. So let's dive into a little bit. Matt, was there anything that jumped out to you in this article in particular about how Huey P. Newton sort of looked at Jesus and his ministry?
Yes, all of it jumped out. It was all jumping out the page at me and screaming, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" Yeah, it's all extremely cool. This is a reading of Jesus as the sort of like a figurehead of a popular movement, and to think of Jesus as a figurehead of a popular movement, shouldn't be surprising. I mean, he had disciples and there are people following him around. Of course that's what he was. But we think of him always in terms of I guess religious movements, but in the way that Newton talks about him here, he's sort of the figure of a political movement, which I know all of my New Testament scholar friends probably have a lot to say about, and I don't know. I don't know about that, but it's an interesting way to think about him. The other thing I really do like about this piece so much is not only is Jesus characterized as a figure of a popular movement, but so is Barabbas.
Yeah, that's right.
The sort of he only comes up one time in the Gospels, and it's he gets let out of jail because the people want Barabbas free. So there's some interesting dynamics going on here between Jesus and Barabbas as being figures that are more similar than they are different, I think. There's definitely some interesting things to talk about with regards to that. I don't know. What was interesting to you, Dean? We can come back to the Barabbas thing later.
The same things kind of came up for me. A couple of themes to note off the front, I guess. One is that he opens this excerpted text, at least, kind of talking about how religion and politics are sort of importantly related. So he doesn't see them as being, extremely separate. In fact, he says, underneath the seemingly conflicting vocabularies of sacred and secular movements is a unity or unities of tradition and prediction. The dialectic of myth and politics, in fact, is history. And I think that's a really kind of interesting way to get into these kinds of conversations, that you would see the histories of religion and politics as intertwined and not separate. I mean, maybe that comes from Newton having a dad who was also a pastor or something, and then himself being a politician. But there's something kind of cool about that. And I think that really feeds into his vision of Jesus, not just as a person thinking politically about Christ, but someone who thinks that these things are naturally together. I mean, just like Ernesto Cardenal and the Gospel in Solentiname folks, he sees Jesus as a figure from an oppressed place, right? And the most oppressed of oppressed places. So he, just like those peasants in Solentiname, they all sort of pick up on the fact that Jesus is from Nazareth, this extremely poor and boring part of an oppressed part of Rome. I love this part where he says, Jesus' accent, clothes, manners must have been substandard in every way. when measured against the cosmopolitan capital of Jerusalem, despite his obvious genius for communication with both the castes of Sadducees and Pharisees. I just love that attention to kind of imagining what it would be like to be someone like Jesus from this rural provincial town, mixing it up with all these religious authorities from, these city centers. It's just interesting to kind of have that perspective going into it, that these religious and political kind of features are supposed to go together.
Yeah, I mean, like, nothing good comes from Nazareth kind of idea where
right.
Jesus is poor, substandard. That's an interesting way of thinking about it, but still he does the things he does.
Yeah, I also like that he tries to mine Jesus' ministries for political strategies. That's probably the most interesting thing about it to me, because it's one thing to look at the fact that there are political things happening in the Gospels, but it's a whole other thing to look at Jesus as a political figure who's making political decisions. I mean, that's the kind of thing that even people like John Howard Yoder are trying to do, right? The politics of Jesus. But Newton's politics of Jesus are very different from Yoder's. I don't know. Was there anything about that sort of jumped out at you, Matt?
Yeah. Well, he makes some claims that are kind of reminiscent of like Herbert McCabe when we read that thing about class war a while back. So there's a bit where he's talking about the Beatitudes, specifically here. It's Newton says, now it seems quite clear that the injunction of love is meant to be binding within the caste of the poor, but not as between poor and rich, since Jesus himself, both here and later, turns the full venom of his famous tongue on the ruling caste. By calling for unity against the oppressors, he is speaking as man for man to man, and one could not be mystified by the deistic vocabulary of a culture that was, after all, a colonized theocracy. But the benedictions and the curses must be seen as good news brought to the miserable masses of the Middle East. So there's a really cool, class reading of Jesus here that is, I think, not unfamiliar to us on this podcast. Like Herbert McCabe did that kind of thing, and we see it happening in the Gospel in Sultaname and with Fidel and other folks too, that the good news is a good news for the poor, and the rich, well, there's something else, some other type of good news they need to hear. But yeah, so it's binding within the caste of the poor, but not as between the poor and the rich, being I think a pretty instructive way of the way that, Newton thinks about Jesus, but also the way that we continually think about Jesus on this podcast, that like there's something there, that like there's some type of commitment that we find in Jesus over and over again to the poor, and a challenge always brought against the rich. So that was cool to read, and I think really inspiring and good, and reinforcing probably all of those good leftist readings I have done so far. I don't know. What do you think about that part, Dean?
Yeah, no, I picked up some similar vibes, and also I thought it was just interesting how this rubs so hard against the liberal idea of Jesus as this ultimate unifier where all differences are eclipsed, and the goal of, I guess, loving your enemies is to forget that they're your enemies in a way. And what is interesting about both McCabe and Newton here is that what Jesus is trying to do is provide tools by which people who are being oppressed can have solidarity with one another. And that in no way is meant to occlude the real differences between their situation and the situation of their oppressors. One wild thing that Newton says, pushing that a little bit further, is that only the poor can actually understand Jesus' miracles. This is a pretty materialistic reading. I mean, he doesn't come exactly right out and say this, but I think it's not pushing it too far to think this is kind of what he has in mind. But it seems like he's sort of suggesting, the miracle is that Jesus would ever have united the poor in Rome. And that's exactly why the Sadducees and Pharisees for Newton can't understand Jesus, or why they're constantly misunderstanding his parables, constantly not getting the same kind of word from Jesus. There's a part where he quotes that part in the Gospels where Jesus says, a sign will be given to this generation. And of course, lots of signs are given to poor people in particular in the Gospels. And Newton is playing that line by saying, well, if you're in the oppressed class, all these things are miraculous. The people are coming together and, sharing their food and distributing, wealth among themselves. But to the ruling caste, those things are not miraculous. In fact, they're the worst possible thing that could be happening. So in that sense, I think it's really interesting to kind of see how this vision of Jesus as not as a divider necessarily, but as someone who recognizes the divisions that are already set within society and is trying to actually contribute to one side over and against the other. That's a vision of Jesus that I think a lot of Christians, especially in first world contexts, have a hard time exploring.
Yeah. I mean, I know that we've talked about this before, but why not talk about it again? I mean, something that you said sort of at the top of the last comment you just made was that loving your enemies doesn't mean forgetting that they're your enemies. And that's a really, I think, important lesson for Christians to learn when it comes to class divisions, in the sense that like what it means to love the rich might mean to tell them to like, unburden themselves. Because that's like, that's a division, that's a dividing line that they've put up, that they are like actively keeping some people in a different economic status, and that is not great. So to love your enemies might mean to like tell them to stop being your enemy, I guess. Like it seems like kind of simple, but something that a rich person would never hear. Like they wouldn't understand that at all. They'd get weighed down with the sort of utilitarian idea that like, well, they could do so much good with their money and stuff like that, but really the best thing they could do is distribute it to other people.
Right. No, totally.
Stop expropriating labor from other folks or whatever, Yeah. I mean, there's nothing that really says love more than trying to correct someone's like bad behavior. Maybe that's like the parent in me speaking, but like, if you like really love someone, you want them to like stop messing up and stop like being like bad in some way. So like you have to tell them to stop. Telling the rich to unburden themselves of their wealth is like is a thing that you say because you care about them.
Right. And that's sort of the weird thing about the class consciousness of rich folks in general, is that they don't recognize the poor as their enemies, and they can't love them as their enemies in that way, which is not a good situation, right? Because when they are confronted with that correction, they don't view it as a kind of loving correction from an enemy. They view it as a, I don't know what they view it as,
like resentment, not that. Right? Like,
yeah,
like
exactly.
It's if a rich person were to hear this conversation we're having right now, listen, if you're rich and you're hearing this conversation right now, please
donate to our Patreon.
Consider something different. Yeah, that's right though. They would hear though like someone who wishes they were rich and who's jealous or whatever.
Yeah. Right. And it's weird that rich folks sort of get off the hook too on those calls to love your enemy. Like poor people have to love their enemy by, I guess, being nice to them and not ever getting out of their place or getting out of line. Whereas rich folks have to love their enemies by giving philanthropically, like giving back the very thing that they already expropriated from them.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
I mean, capitalism just totally messes up, I think, our Christian ethical consciousness, such as it is, which is a pretty, I don't know, that's something that I feel like Christians should genuinely be upset about. Like it's hard to understand what Jesus is asking you to do in a capitalist society, because capitalism breaks your brain. Like it makes you think certain things that are in conflict with other ways that you're trying to get formed, and that's not what you want.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The thing about the wealthy and sort of like the way they see their ethical commitment to other folks is like, yeah, philanthropy, but like it is confused because it's like, well, you got that wealth by, some less than honest means, most likely. Unless, I don't know, I can't think of a way that you'd make a ton of money, sort of like cleanly. But but yeah, I mean, like, I guess what bugs me about it is that philanthropy is always such a utilitarian thing where it's like, well, I'm a rich person. I have like a lot of money, and I know that like the division, like the sort of inequality, the economic inequality in society is bad, but I know that I can do like a lot of really good things with this money, and like only I know how to do it, right? Instead of like stopping the cycle of exploitation, they don't. They just try to sort of figure out the places they can give the most amount of money to do the most amount of good. And not saying that like philanthropy is bad or something, because like lots of good things come from it, but it's still like within the cycle of exploitation of labor and other sorts of forms of oppression.
Yeah, I mean, philanthropy is bad insofar as it makes rich people feel good about themselves and justify their exploitation, and it makes poor folks view rich people as their saviors when in fact they're exploiters. I mean, whatever. It's not bad that poor people sometimes get more more stuff than they would have had otherwise. Like, that's good, I guess.
That's what I meant. Sorry, yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, it does sort of obfuscate the root of the problem, and that's silly and self-defeating, and also a mechanism for maintaining a status quo.
Right. Well, speaking of all that, let's just do a real hard left to Barabbas here.
No, I mean,
talking about somebody who also doesn't like the status quo.
But like speaking of either the rich or another option, Barabbas, he's the lesser of two evils in this sense. No, that wasn't a good one.
Well done.
Yeah, I don't know.
You did it.
So a minute ago, I was talking about Barabbas and sort of the role that he plays in this essay about Jesus, and Newton mentions him a few times, but he mentions him like as I mean, not of maybe the same movement of which Jesus is a part, but more like Jesus than Rome is like Jesus, I guess. He's a revolutionary figure. There's one point where he talks about Barabbas as sort of a guerrilla, which is interesting way of thinking of Barabbas's character. Someone that we don't really hear about very much in the New Testament. He's just like, freed from prison, and I don't know, New Testament scholars kind of frame him as like a zealot, someone who's going to be like an insurrectionist. But Barabbas is framed in the Newton essay as being the lesser of two evils. Like, if the choice is between Rome or insurrection, Barabbas is the lesser of those two evils. That was pretty wild.
Yeah, even more than that. So he does seem as the lesser of two evils between, I guess, Rome and Barabbas. Barabbas is clearly the superior figure. But even more than that, Newton says, so he's criticizing what he calls 20th century understandings of the Gospels. He says they no longer permit the enlightened view of Jesus as simply a self-conscious lever to move God and humankind into a new relationship of grace. He says missing from these studies of the Gospels is the stench and conspiracy, the insurrectionary yeast of occupied Judea, where Jesus and Barabbas are but the hammer and anvil of popular rebellion. I think that is so crazy to kind of see them as similar figures or somehow working towards similar ends. I mean, it's hard not to read this as a kind of Malcolm and Martin situation, which is what the Panthers are in some ways inheriting, right? The sort of legacies of both of those figures. And there's something that you can kind of see that here, that Barabbas is played off not as the bad guy who gets to go free, which is, I guess, how I heard it in catechism when I was a kid. But rather he's a real force of popular revolution, which is why the people would demand him to go free. Like, they don't demand him just because they hate Jesus so much or something, which is maybe like a weird latent anti-Semitism that I inherited or something in my Catholic formation. But rather they demand Barabbas to go free because, like, he actually kind of means something to the people in a way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he's just such like a character that gets pushed aside in the I don't know, the ways that we engage with the gospel in church. Like, I don't know, the only time you'd ever really hear about Barabbas is like towards Easter or something, right? When like you're kind of going through the Passion, and Barabbas goes free and like that's it, and you never really think about what he means. But he's like a popular figure, right? Like he's on the side of those people, so it makes some sense in that context.
That's right. So it's interesting. Maybe we could kind of move to the conclusion of this bit where Newton is reflecting on Jesus in the end. So like I said earlier, this piece comes out of a book that he wrote called Revolutionary Suicide, which is a pretty wild book. I mean, it is very intense and the title is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's like, if you're a revolutionary, you have to commit your life to that revolution. And a lot of the Panthers obviously did. I mean, they paid with their lives, both in some cases by losing it, but also in other cases by being incarcerated. You know, there are Panthers who are still incarcerated. And it's interesting to see Newton reflecting on Jesus, who also gave his life for a certain revolutionary cause, as Newton reads it. He closes this piece by quoting Albert Schweitzer, who was a famous German Protestant biblical commentator who went on to do a ton of really intense work with the poor. He says, Albert Schweitzer summed up Jesus's historic dilemma by saying that when Jesus put his shoulder to the wheel of history, it did not move. Then, said Schweitzer, he threw himself upon it and the wheel turned. This act of downgoing, in the Nietzschean sense, is the birth of the Superman, or say simply man, and the consciousness of the masses as history. The wheel turned, myth became history, and for a moment, God became man. So you can see this real vision of Jesus as I don't know if you want to say the crucifixion is a revolutionary suicide, but it's not too far off the mark to see that in a way. And maybe it's kind of an interesting line of thought that especially leftist Christians might consider as sort of viewing Jesus's moment as exactly that, right? Trying to really force history to move in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think we could say a few things about that. So I know like one thing that people on Twitter hate us for is for like reading Jesus entirely too materially. Like that's a critique people give us from time to time. And yeah, like that's probably true every now and again. But even if we don't, I mean, I think that thinking of Jesus as sort of a revolutionary in some sense completely makes sense. Even if you want to think about it in terms of the more like salvific narratives, in terms of like metaphysics and sin and stuff. There's it's a revolutionary act where we have to like recognize that Jesus like goes to hell, gets the keys and opens the gates. Like that's a movement of liberation, even if you don't want to kind of deal with the material end of the spectrum. Like fine. So I don't know. It doesn't seem all that hard to believe to me, or like, you know, it's not that controversial to me. But like that's the criticism that people give us sometimes, and I think that even if you find the like more materialist readings of Jesus and the Gospels too hard to deal with, or like, you know, not interesting to you or whatever, I think reading them along more orthodox lines still makes sense in this way.
Yeah, and it's also like, sure, whatever, Jesus died for your sins. However you work that out, that's fine. I mean, there's a lot of ways Christians have worked that out over the histories, but Jesus also lived like a real life human life, and that's also an extremely orthodox Christian opinion.
Yes.
And if you think that that's true, then you have to view Jesus as bumping up with other human beings and having relationships with them and doing things with them and to them and receiving things from them. And humans are political creatures. It's just a fact of human life. So, I mean, there's always going to be that material dimension of Jesus. And I guess just like how we were saying earlier, the Panther Party is useful in church when it tells the church where it's going wrong. Materialists are useful reading Jesus by telling us where Jesus is materially relevant. And that's a thing that I think a lot of Christians have a hard time seeing, and a thing that people like Newton can kind of help us get back on track with.
Yeah, I think so. That's cool.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. This has been a good time. Matt and I have both been traveling a bunch, so we decided to take a break from getting some guests for a while. Hopefully it was a good conversation. We had a good time talking about Huey P. Newton. We mentioned that we talked to Vincent Lloyd in episode 6, so if you forgot the couple times we mentioned it, I guess now you know. Now you can go listen to it right now after this one.
Yeah, also, we mentioned an episode of Revolutionary Left Radio. The episode, I don't know what number it is, but the episode's just titled The Black Panther Party, so go back and check that out too. It's definitely worth your time.
It really is, and fills out, I think, a lot more than what we can here in this episode, especially. That would be really useful. You can also find more of us, this podcast, all over the internet in a variety of places. You can find us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can find us on Facebook at the Magnificast. You can find our discussion group, the Magnificast Basement, and you can tell us all your funny stories about reading the Black Panthers in public around people who just know about movies. You can find us on Patreon /the Magnificast, where you can slip us a couple bucks and contribute to this revolutionary activity if you want. Those are all the things you can do. You can email us too, also, I guess. We do have an email, themagnificast@gmail.com. Easy enough. And the last two things, we are on 2 podcast networks, which are worth mentioning. One is Theology Corner, and that's full of all kinds of interesting authors, friends of ours, other podcasts, people you can hang out with. A lot of people there have really a ton of affinities with what we're doing here and are expanding that in their own ways and doing their own thing and talking about Christianity and the left in really, really cool ways. So I would encourage you to check that out. And the other is a platform called Critical Media, and Revolutionary Left is on there. Friendly Anarchism, who we've talked to in the past, is on there. Lots of really good folks. So we've got our feet in both camps, the left camp and the Christian camp of, I guess, growing media empires. So there you go. There you have it. We're doing it. Really doing it. 2018. Cool. Well, that's it. We're going to let the Theological Spoon play us out. You can learn all about not getting up for church in the morning.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, soul's alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.